Winter had a way of stacking itself around her. Outside the apartment, the city hummed under a skin of frost, but inside, the noise was muffled to a distant, constant hush. On the small television in the corner, the screen flickered with the soft hiss of an old tape. Washed-out colors, warped edges, a bright rectangle of light over a stainless steel table. There he was again. A tiger, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, ribs like fingers pressed against his own skin, breathing in shallow, uncertain strokes. One hind leg was shaved and bandaged, the fur around it stained with iodine and memory. A drip line hung above him, clear fluid falling in slow, metronomic drops. In the grainy footage, a younger woman moved into frame, her hair pulled back, her shoulders squared against fear. She wore a thin green field jacket over scrubs, and at her wrist a narrow copper bracelet caught the light every time she adjusted the bandage or checked the tiny chest for breath. Gloved fingers slid gently under the cub's jaw, lifting his head. Even through the blur, his eyes were unmistakable, molten amber, too old for such a small body, flaring once, then softening as his muzzle settled against her arm. On the sofa today, decades later, Dr. E. Lena Hart sat forward, elbows on her knees, watching herself move across the glass. The room around her was quiet, stacks of veterinary journals leaning against the wall, folders labeled with years that didn't matter anymore, a coffee mug with a ring of dried tea at the bottom. The copper bracelet was still on her wrist, softer now, edges rounded by years of skin and time. When the younger Lena on the screen lowered her forearm to the cage, the cub's paw reached out weakly, claws sheathed, and rested on that one familiar place. In the present, the older Lena mirrored the motion without thinking, lifting her arm, touching the back of her own wrist with the fingers of her other hand, feeling for a weight that was no longer there. Her apartment was full of silence, but it was not empty. It held the echo of every breath she had watched over, every heartbeat she had counted in the dark. Somewhere in the middle of all that, a single story had never really ended. It had simply been paused, like the tape in front of her, waiting for someone to press play again. If stories like this touch something quiet inside you, you're in the right place. Follow this channel for more wordless bonds that the heart can still understand. On the shelf above the television, a single framed photograph faced the room. In it, a full-grown tiger stood in a sunlit clearing, body powerful and whole, a faint white smudge above his left eye catching the light. His gaze was turned directly toward the camera, toward the person behind it, as if there were no distance at all between them. Lena let the tape run until the screen went blue, then reached for the remote with careful fingers. Somewhere far from the winter-stilled city, in another country and another climate, a tiger with the same scar was still alive, and for the first time in years, she felt the old pull of a road that led back to him. The memory did not start in an apartment. It began under rain. 30 years earlier, the world around Lena had been green in a way that almost hurt to look at. Monsoon forest, dense and breathing, pressed close around a dirt road that had turned to slick, red mud. The rescue jeep idled with a coughing engine while forest guards in damp uniforms leaned over something crumpled at the roadside. From the back of the vehicle, Lena saw it first as a shape that didn't belong to any tree, orange and black against the sludge, a loop of dull metal flashing at the edge. Her boots sank as she jumped down, mud swallowing her ankles, the smell of wet leaves and rust thick in the air. The cub lay twisted on his side, one hind leg pulled at an impossible angle by a snare of coiled wire anchored to a buried stake. The flesh above the paw was swollen, raw, ringed with a deep groove where the metal had bitten again and again every time he'd tried to pull free. His flanks rose and fell with shallow, panicked breaths. His pupils were blown wide, catching each movement like threats. Lena dropped to her knees beside him, water soaking through her trousers. She stripped on gloves with hands that somehow stayed steady. One palm hovered over his chest, feeling the rapid hammer of his heart. The rain drummed on leaves, on tin, on the hood of the Jeep, on the thin bones beneath her fingers. The wire didn't come off easily. Bolt cutters slipped once on the slick metal. The cub flinched, eyes flaring, jaws opening around a sound too tired to fully form. Someone held a tarp up to shield them from the worst of the downpour. Lena bent closer, shoulders hunched, hair plastered to her forehead, jacket darkened to near black. Each movement was deliberate, pad the wound, cut away only what must be cut, leave enough skin for healing. The smell of blood mixed with wet earth and diesel. When the wire finally fell loose, the leg remained limp, as if the limb had forgotten that it belonged to a living animal. For a heartbeat, Lena feared she had arrived too late. Then, the cub exhaled, a long, ragged release, his head sinking into the mud for just a moment before she and the guards lifted him onto the waiting stretcher. They carried him into the small field clinic at the edge of the forest, a low building of cracking plaster and humming fluorescent lights. On the metal table inside, under the glare, he looked even smaller. A patch of fur above his left eye showed a faint, irregular white smear, like a crescent thumbprint left by someone who had touched him there and never wiped it away. Lena noticed it as she adjusted the IV line, her copper bracelet glinting once under the light. Without deciding to, she let her forearm rest where his whiskers brushed the metal. If he woke, she wanted the first thing he felt to be something steady. He did not come back all at once. In the first weeks, the clinic's recovery ward smelled of antiseptic and wet fur. Nights folded into each other, power cuts, candles, the soft cough of generators kicking in. On a narrow cot beside the cub's enclosure, Lena learned the rhythm of his breathing before she ever heard her own name spoken in this place. He lay on thick blankets while the wound at his leg closed slowly from an angry red ring into a tight, puckered scar. Fever rose and fell. Sometimes he shivered so hard his claws scraped the metal floor. She would slide her green jacket off, fold it, and push it through the low hatch as a barrier between his side and the cold. The first time, he ignored it. The second, he dragged it under his chest with his good paw. There it stayed, damp and wrinkled, smelling of rain and human skin. Each night, when the others had gone, Lena sat cross-legged on the concrete just outside the bars, back against the wall, chart on her lap. She wrote numbers, temperature, respiration, dosage, and then stopped writing, watching instead. When his breaths hitched, she lifted her left wrist and rested it lightly against the metal rail, the copper bracelet making a soft, recognizable tap. Over days, his eyes began to find that sound in the half-dark. A whiskered muzzle would drift toward her arm, hesitate, then settle, so that his nose almost touched the bracelet. Time, in that room, measured itself in molted whiskers on the floor and new stripes stretching over growing muscles. The cub learned to stand, to put tentative weight on the damaged leg. At first, he collapsed in a knot of limbs and frustration, teeth bared at nothing. Lena said nothing back. She only walked the length of the enclosure on the outside, matching his step for step, pausing when he paused, resuming when he tried again. Months loosened into years. The flimsy cage gave way to a larger exercise paddock behind the clinic, with scrub grass, a shallow pool, a sun-warmed rock. The cub became a young tiger who could vanish in one stride into dappled shadow and return in the next, with mud on his belly. Yet every evening, when the sky slid toward indigo and the insects grew louder, Lena stood at the same section of fence, jacket collar open, bracelet catching the last light. He always came. Sometimes he trotted. Sometimes he stalked as if practicing a hunt he would never be allowed to finish. But he came. He would press the broad side of his head against the wire until it hummed, aligning the spot above his left eye, the faint white crescent, with the exact place her pulse beat under copper and skin. It might have gone on forever like that, a ritual carved into routine, if not for the day the letter with the government seal arrived and a truck bigger than anything the clinic had ever needed rolled through the gate. The truck arrived on a Monday, when the sky was too bright for bad news. It rumbled into the dusty yard with its steel sides shining, a crate bolted to the flatbed and empty for now, smelling of metal and sawdust. The letter that preceded it lay open on the clinic desk, its ink already memorized. A larger sanctuary in the hills, more space, more funding, a chance for appropriate long-term care. Lines of justification stacked neatly over the place where Lena's name appeared as one of many signatures. She walked out to the paddock anyway. On the far side of the fence, the tiger was stretched along the ground, a spill of orange and black against the green. He was full-grown now, shoulders heavy, head broad, the scar at his hind leg pulling slightly when he shifted his weight. From a distance he seemed like a piece of the forest that had decided, for the moment, to lie still. The capture went as gently as such things can. A sedative dart that bit like an insect, A staggering approach to the waiting crate, limbs folding against will and gravity. The staff moved in practiced motions, rugs under paws, foam padding against flanks, the door sliding shut with a low, final clang. Lena stood where she always stood, at the line of fence, forearm resting on the same post, the bracelet of copper pressed against wood instead of wire. For a moment, before the drug pulled him under completely, the tiger lifted his head inside the crate. Heavy lids narrowed, then widened, as if trying to focus past bars and sun and distance. His gaze found the familiar shimmer at her wrist. He exhaled once, a slow spill of air, and let his forehead come to rest against the crate's inner wall at the same height as her hand. On one side, flesh and bone. On the other, skin and metal, and a person who had run out of reasons to say no on paper. The truck pulled away, and the ground shook as if the earth itself were adjusting to the absence. Years layered over that moment like silt in a riverbed. The clinic gave way to larger hospitals closer to cities. Night shifts turned into lectures, conferences, and later into quieter consulting work, done from a small desk by a window. A thin gold band appeared on Lena's finger, then did not. Her hair silvered. The green jacket moved from hook to hanger. The copper bracelet stayed. She did not look for him, not because she had forgotten, but because the world taught her that tigers did not grow old in peace. It was kinder, she told herself in unspoken thoughts, not to know. Then, on an ordinary evening in the present, her thumb brushed a video on her phone without really meaning to. The screen filled with the image of an elderly tiger in a broad, grassy enclosure, moving with the measured care of a body that remembered pain. He approached a section of chain-link fence, ignoring the calls and cameras around him. He stopped, lowered his head, pressed the side of his face against a specific square of metal, and held it there, eyes closing. A faint white crescent above his left eye catching the light just so. There was no sound in the clip beyond wind and distant birds, but Lena heard the thud of her own heart, sudden and loud, as if it belonged to the animal on the screen. At the corner of the video, small text named the sanctuary and the country. Her hand, still wearing the old bracelet, reached for a pen. The ink trembled just enough to prove she was still alive. The journey back to him began with lines. Lines on a map traced by a trembling fingertip. From the gray city where winter clung to sidewalks, across oceans and borders, to a valley of green field and rust-colored earth. Lines of text on a ticket confirmation, on a passport page, on a medical form she filled out honestly enough to make the airline clerk hesitate and then nod. Lena packed lightly. The green jacket, folded with a care it had never received when it was new. The copper bracelet, which she did not take off. A small stack of photocopied records from the old clinic, edges frayed. The photograph of the young tiger with the white crescent above his eye slid into the front pocket of her bag. Airports blurred into each other. Tiled floors, metal chairs, the low hum of announcements in languages that rolled past her like water. On the plane, she traced the outline of the bracelet with her thumb while clouds moved slowly beneath the wing. Somewhere down there, she thought, a body she had once lifted with both hands, now moved through the world on its own terms, if it still moved at all. The sanctuary lay at the end of a narrow road that climbed through low hills and scrubby forest, the air growing warmer, softer, as if the earth itself shared a different memory of the sun here. High fences appeared first, tall, sturdy, draped in climbing plants that tried and failed to hide their strength. Beyond them, flashes of color and movement, the rise and fall of striped backs in long grass. Staff in faded uniforms met her with clipboards and warm professional smiles. They knew her name, if not her history. Paperwork was exchanged, safety rules outlined. Somewhere, a gate clanged shut. When they brought her to his enclosure, they let her walk the last stretch alone. A raised platform ran along one edge, shaded by a tin roof. The air carried the scents of dust, meat, and something older, a wildness that even decades of captivity could not fully dilute. He was lying under a low tree near the back fence when she first saw him, a broad, heavy body striped in fire and shadow, flanks rising in slow, economical breaths. His face was fuller, jaw more square, but the pale crescent above his left eye was like a thumbprint time had not dared smudge. He did not get up. His tail flicked once against the earth. as if acknowledging a distant insect. Lena eased herself onto the bench along the viewing rail, careful of her knees. She set the folded green jacket beside her, the fabric a muted echo of another climate, another year. Then she slipped the copper bracelet loose for the first time in a long while, weighed it in her palm, and slid it back into place with a small, decisive turn. She did not call to him. She did not lean forward or wave. She simply rested her left forearm along the cool metal bar at the edge of the platform, exactly as she had against the clinic fence so long ago, and let the bracelet touch steel with a soft, familiar tap. The sound was small, almost nothing, instantly swallowed by birdsong and distant engines. But his ears twitched. His eyes opened, amber catching a thread of light, and for a heartbeat the air between them felt thinner, as if part of the fence had turned to breath. He did not stand. Not yet. She came back the next day, and the next, always at the same hour, always with the same quiet ritual of jacket, bracelet, forearm, and waiting. The question hung between them, heavy as the humid air. How long does a memory live in an animal that was never taught to forget? It happened on an afternoon that looked like any other. Heat pooled over the valley, soft and heavy. In the distance, the calls of other cats and birds rose and fell like a slow tide. Lena walked the now familiar path to his enclosure with measured steps, the green jacket over her shoulders despite the warmth, the bracelet cool against her wrist. He was already near the fence, not pressed close, not pacing, simply there, resting on his belly in a patch of shade where the grass thinned, front paws crossed, head lifted, as if he had been waiting for something he could not name. The white crescent above his left eye seemed sharper in the angled light, like a small moon rising out of his own fur. She sat on the bench, placed the jacket beside her, and let her breath settle. Her body had learned to move more slowly, but the gesture itself was as clean as it had ever been. Left forearm forward, resting along the rail, the copper bracelet touching the metal with that same soft tap. This time, he rose. It was not a dramatic leap, not a sudden charge. It was the careful, deliberate push of an old body, gathering itself for something important. Muscles uncoiled along his back. His tail swept once, twice. Each step toward her left a deeper print in the dusty ground, recording the weight of years as plainly as ink. He came all the way to the fence and stopped so close that she could see each individual whisker, the fine scars on his nose, the faint clouding at the edges of his eyes. For a long moment he simply stood there, looking not at the crowd behind her or the trees beyond, but at the place where metal met skin. Then he leaned in. He pressed the side of his face against the chain link directly in front of her wrist, slow and sure, closing his eyes as the mesh pushed into his fur. His breath washed over her skin, warm and tinged with the wildness that had never left him. The white crescent slotted into the space just above the bracelet, exactly where the bars of the old clinic cage had once been. Lena did not move her arm. Her fingers curled lightly around the rail, nothing more. The trembling came from somewhere deeper, a fault line shifting as the past and present finally aligned in one small square of contact. Around them, the sanctuary quieted. A keeper lowering a bucket paused with it half to the ground. Another, halfway through writing notes, forgot the pen on the page. Someone lifted a camera, then lowered it again, unwilling to frame the moment into anything smaller than what it already was. The tiger stayed like that, head bowed, cheek pressed to the fence, as if listening through metal for the echo of his own heartbeat in her pulse. After a while, he adjusted, turning just enough to slide the bridge of his nose along the rail so that his scarred hind leg came into view, bearing weight without complaint. It was as if he were offering her the healed wound she had once held in her hands, proof that her work had not disappeared when the truck drove away. When at last he stepped back, it was only by a pace. He lowered himself into the dust right there, against the fence, and let his flank rest along it so that the wire left faint impressions on his fur. Lena mirrored him without meaning to, spine pressed to the back of the bench, their lines of rest separated by a few inches of air and steel, and 30 years that had just for a moment ceased to matter. In the weeks that followed, she came every afternoon, and he came to meet her. Some days he only lay nearby, eyes half closed, as if satisfied that the story had been allowed to finish. On others, he repeated the ritual of pressing the crescent of his face to the bracelet, like a key, checking that its lock still existed. When his enclosure was quiet one day, and the staff's eyes were soft with a different kind of knowing, Lena walked the perimeter alone. At the corner where he used to meet her, the ground was worn into a shallow hollow. On one side, the broad, softened shapes of paws that had come back again and again. On the other, a narrower strip where one pair of shoes had stood so often. The grass had simply given up. She unclasped the copper bracelet for the last time. The skin beneath it was pale, a ring of memory. She looped the bracelet over a fence post at their spot, letting it hang at the exact height of a resting tiger's cheek, then stepped back. The metal swung once in the breeze and stilled, catching the afternoon light. Somewhere, in a place beyond enclosures and maps, a young vet and a half-starved cub were meeting for the first time, all over again. And here, in this valley, all that remained was a worn patch of earth, a circle of copper, and the knowledge that recognition had, against all odds, lasted long enough to find its way home.